So this session will be recorded, but it's unlikely there'll be a lot of chat. I'll definitely leave a little room at the end for Q&A, but I'll stop the recording when I do that. Right, let's kick off. In terms of the agenda, what I'm going to take you through first is just an overview of the way it connects, the two applications connect to one another. So it's like starting the movie at the end, like that terrible extraction film that you can see on Netflix at the moment, where it gives you the ending right at the beginning and then tortuously takes you through how they got to that point. Hopefully mine will be a little bit more interesting, but I'll show you the end before we go through the bits to actually get there. So that's agenda point 1. The first step in the road to reaching your destination is to basically establish a connection between Power BI and UniPhi. So we'll go through how you do that. Then we'll look at how you can build reports, what you can build, not necessarily the specifics, just some samples of the types of things that you can get out of the system once that connection is there. Once you're happy with your reports, how you can share them and publish them either via using your organization's Power BI Workspace or embedding them into the UniPhi application. So we'll look at both of those two options. And then we'll have a go. We'll look at our first attempt to build a report, a terrifying thought at the end there. And so, yeah, hopefully, just seeing what's possible initially will make you stay through the rest of the 45 minutes to get to that end goal of building a specific report. I'll come back to that step in a moment. Okay, so the first bit is to sort of talk about the way these two systems talk to one another and conceptualize that. Essentially, UniPhi is the data source of everything that you're reporting on in Power BI. It is possible to bring in other data sources. For example, we have a client where we pull in public holidays from a different source, and we connect those to the financial calendar, and you're able to then basically exclude those days from utilization counts on both timesheeting and resource planning. But essentially, majority of it is the data is captured in the UniPhi database through the UniPhi interfaces that you may well or not be that well known as to how that works. So across the top here, you've got all of these modules that you can capture information. You can see the types of information, issues and risks, costs and contracts, feasibility information, timesheet information, resource planning, and the like. So once you've captured all of that information, and within the system, there's sort of feedback loops and reports embedded within it. But if you want to do more analysis, create more portfolio style reporting, there's almost a limitless number of types of reporting options that people have come to us with over the years. You can now potentially build that yourself using the connection to Power BI. And so what happens is that Power BI is a consumer of information. So it will pull down that information into its own data structure. So it's actually like a copy of the data that exists in UniPhi. But the good point that makes it easier to do that is instead of it being based on the data structures that exist in UniPhi's database, we have built a API that enables us to pull that information out in a more user-friendly way. So you can see in this screen now all the different what we call endpoints that you're able to call into the Power BI application. We use this API for other reasons as well, other purposes, but embedded within your application under the hamburger screen is this API documentation, and it lists all the endpoints, and I'll come back to it later, you can play around with it a little bit more, but it does show you what's available to pull out of the application into Power BI and then start to use it. So that's the connecting glue between the UniPhi application and the Power BI application is this API. And by connecting those up, what you're getting is dynamic reads from the UniPhi application itself into these dashboards. And what you can do with that is either embed that or publish it to a workspace and have that be viewed by anyone who's got access to UniPhi or who's got access to your company's Power BI workspace. And so if I was to look at the end first and to see the character dying on a bridge before we find out how he got there, spoiler alert, we go into this Power BI embedded and we can start to see Visualisations. So this is a benchmarks dashboard in Power BI. The basics of Power BI training, which is outside the scope of this webinar, is learning about the difference between a dashboard and a report, and even a workspace and workbook. That terminology is Power BI specific. This is a dashboard from Power BI published within the UniPhi framework. So you can still see all the UniPhi modules across the top, and you can still browse around and do that sort of thing. If I browse to one of these sub-navs, I get reports instead of dashboards. And refresh the page and it should come back in. There we go, slight heart attack, but we're good. And what you can see along the bottom is a whole bunch of tabs like you would in Excel, and each one of those is its own report that you can build, and you can build as many as you like. And the main reason to go into this now is just to give you a flavor of the sorts of things you can start to build. So here's a combination of different graphs within one report, showing cash flow profiles, counts of projects by sector and by location and sector, and counts of projects by type. You can build these little slices, they call them, where you get that embedded to your end user so they can then look at specific or multiple thereof sectors. You can configure that to be multi-select or single, and the graphs update, as you can see. And so as we go along, you'll see the variety of different things that you can analyze. This is analyzing milestone dates. And if you get the color coding and the descriptions right, you might have that as being shovel-ready projects in a modern parlance, and when they'd be ready. You can reformat that to be a sort of staggered timeline. So we've got 2015, we've got 2016, and as we scroll down with the months going across the top, you can see you know, when things are actually going to happen. And like I said, the red might be shovel-ready projects, the brown might be a practical completion. You make up your own milestone descriptions to get them into here. And that's a portfolio report, again, that can be filtered if you've created it with that to have the filters over on the right-hand side to filter by any kind of metadata that exists in the UniPhi application. You can link it in with geographic information and get a geographical view of your data. Kind of covered benchmarks already. You can analyze time and utilization and revenue around the world. So how much is non-billable and billable, how much is marketing. You can trend your cash flows over time, but also have them report month to month. There's a little focus mode in here that you can click on to get that to blow up and have a little bit more of a view of it. One of the things I find in Power BI is that it definitely increases the need for glasses. And so you'll need to work through those sort of visual issues yourself. Time analysis, as I said, issues, analyzing issues, which is one of the things we're going to sort of focus on in the back end of this presentation. You can build your own Gantt view of the data in UniPhi and have fun with that. Everyone loves having fun with Gantt. A different type of dashboard, looking at different type of things. We've got some benchmarking, we've got some safety stats here. We've got some risk information down on the left-hand corner. Got some time information in the middle, cash flow, again, geographic. This is feasibility options, looking at different MPV outcomes based on changes in feasibility assumptions. So that can be quite good for looking at what drives changes. These are the ups and downs of an MPV calc based on, you know, the 1 and 2 bedroom rentals, construction costs, etc. That can be an interesting one to see. And these are the scenarios, base case, more 1 bedrooms and lower rent, construction cost blowouts. Obviously, they're going to go down, but it's demonstrating how sensitive that is. And you can build these yourself to analyze that sort of stuff. And the rest are more benchmarking related graphs. So that's embedded within UniPhi, but where did it come from? How did it get built? It gets built in an application that Microsoft has developed, which is the Power BI desktop application. And so if I was to click on this little major projects desktop window here, what it does is it loads up exactly the same view of the information, but in the designer, if you like, in the application. It enables you to build them in the first place. And so all of those tabs that we just went through are still listed here on the bottom right hand, on the bottom of the system. And this is a raw, you know, build it yourself, move things around, create new things as you see fit. You can see there's a little plus there, and I can click on that and start to build a new one. The connection, as I said, between the UniPhi application and this Power BI desktop file is our API that I showed you the screen for. And you can see that listed here, exactly the same naming as what was in the screen when I showed you the Swagger, as it's called. It's API documentation. And so it's, you know, most project managers' terminology will be familiar with budgets, hopefully, and cash flow and milestones and issues and you know, that type of concept, contracts. And as we scroll down, there'll be project, resource planning, risks, timesheets. And so when you expand those, it gives you access to the fields within them, and you can start to play around and try and build up content that fits your needs. That's kind of like next week's expansion, but we will get to a basic entry point to that before the end of the session. The fundamentals out of that first agenda point item is just to get your head around the fact that there's a unified database that's capturing application through a web interface. People are timesheeting to it. They're managing contracts, issuing progress claims, variation orders, putting timelines in and milestones. All of that data is getting captured on a low level detail by people per project. And then in Power BI, we can aggregate and cut and dice and start to visualize that information in a multitude of ways through this desktop application. And then finally, we would use this publishing capability to either publish to the UniPhi embedded viewer, which I showed you before, or to your own company's workspace, which is a web application view of it in Power BI's own sort of design. So it's a Microsoft interface. And a lot of companies already have that interface, already have licenses, and it's quite possible to publish these files to that environment and have people share that particular information. So that's the sort of conceptual architectural overview of that. The data, as you can see, gets refreshed. That is actually an extraction, transform, and load process. So extract out of UniPhi, transform it into using the API to a method that Power BI can use, and then load that into the Power BI database so that it can do its visualizations. That, you can imagine, is resource intensive. So one of the things to be aware of is you would want to be, if you're doing the designing, if you're in the desktop version, once you're viewing it, it's not a problem in the web application, either UniPhi or Power BI Workspace. But if you're a designer of these things, if you're designing reports, campaign to get as high spec computer as you can. Power BI is a resource hungry application, and it requires good CPU and good RAM on the computer that you're using. I've got a really lightweight laptop I'm using at the moment. If I opened multiple files of this thing, it would kill my machine. So with that in mind, I want to work with a simpler one. And so we're going to go through the steps now of how to create a simple connection when you haven't got all these noisy graphs that we've created for other purposes. And so just flicking back to my PowerPoint for a moment. The steps to connect. So a couple of things around this. I'm recording this session. It'll be published within the next 24 hours. And at the end, I'm going to talk about other things that you can do to access help on this. But fundamentally, what will be available is a UniPhi sample file that you can download off our website. It will just be sitting there. Anyone can download it. So the first step is to download the application called Power BI Desktop and install that on your computer. So that might involve you engaging the inhibitors of technology in your business to come to your desk or remote desktop and install that thing, or get you to write a business case for permission to do that, or whatever the case may be. But without it, you can't build your own reports. So that's step number one: download Power BI Desktop and install it on your computer. Then go to our website, download the sample file, and open that up in the Power BI Desktop. Then what you'll need to do, that'll be connecting to a dummy database, so it won't have your data in it. So you'll need to amend the connection from that dummy database to the UniPhi database that you're actually using, and put in your own credentials to draw that data, and then hit refresh. And it's potentially, depending on your deployment, there will be some issues in that if we have an endpoint in our sample file that you don't have any data for, then Power BI will go, hey, there's no data for this. What do you want me to do about it? And so I'll show you how to handle that as well. So this next demonstration is doing those 4 points. What we want to do is just basically take you through those steps to connect, because you can't create a report unless you've connected to the data. So I'm going to begin with, there used to be a tool you could send to people where it would just write in what you wanted them to type into Google, and as soon as they click the link, it would do that. But essentially, it's a Google search. So just Power BI Desktop, and if you've got if you've got access, administrative access rights to that, that's pretty much all you'll need to do is to then do that search, click the button, click download free, and Microsoft goes through this multitude of how many times it wants you to click download. Sometimes it's twice, sometimes it's 4 times, sometimes it's once. It's just depending on randomly on what they're feeling like at that point in time. So this is going to open Microsoft Store if my internet keeps working, and eventually it'll ask you to download it again. It will download an executable file like you would normally install for any software application onto your actual program, as opposed to a web application like UniPhi where you just access it through a browser. So I'm not sure why the store's not opening there, but once you got through that frustrating process, and there might be constraints within your own business to do that, and you install it, what you'll have is an application like this one, which I'm just going to close. And if I was to type Power BI, you can see Power BI desktop application and launch it like you would Excel or Word or anything else. And that's step one. Simple, but sometimes harder than it should be. And as you can see, grinding on my little laptop, it takes a while even just to load the application. Then what you will do is you'll say recent sources or open other reports, probably open other reports the first time, and browse to where you've downloaded the UniPhi template. So don't want that one. And so you've downloaded the UniPhi template, it'll be there. There hopefully won't be any other Power BI, but if you're a super user, then A, you're probably already bored, and B, you'll know what you're doing anyway. And you're opening up the templated file that we have on our website. And what that does is it saves you the rather painful process of connecting to all the endpoints. So it will have all the endpoints that we can connect to with some confidence that the majority of our clients will have their data load. So what's missing from here is anything that we think is, client specific, that is going to throw an error when they connect, and hence you'll need to connect for that endpoint to come in. So if you were to do a reconciliation between the 10 or so endpoints that exist in this template file and the 50 or so endpoints that exist in the UniPhi API documentation, anything that's not in the desktop file, you'll need to connect and transform yourself. And we're going to touch on that a little bit in this conversation, but that's kind of the source of next week's webinar. Because things like custom fields need to be done per client. And so you need to connect to those yourself because they're custom. And hence, if we did it to our dummy database, those custom fields won't exist in your client database, and hence it'll say, I don't like this very much. And so when you scroll down, you'll see there's a whole bunch. I mean, even metrics are very bespoke. Some of you may not even know that UniPhi has this thing called metrics. They're calculated fields that you can create yourself with a formula engine attached to it. And they're the sort of things you can do in UniPhi rather than have to do those in Power BI, and then it'll just flow through to your users to aggregate on. So for example, dollar per square meter of fully enclosed covered area, or dollar per apartment, water floor ratio, something like that. But then you'll see also periodic project custom fields. There'll be resource person custom fields. There'll be project custom fields and issue custom fields, and risk custom fields, a whole bunch of custom fields. They're kind of a subset of the risk and project endpoints, but you connect to that endpoint twice to bring in the project data and then to bring in the custom field data. So anything that's listed here that doesn't appear in here, you can still connect to yourself, but that takes a little bit of training, and then you've got access to that data. Over time, you may expand the default template if we feel that it's, most clients are having to add that in themselves manually. It just depends, but we think we've got a nice subset of what most people will be wanting. We've got cash flow, we've got budgets, we've got contracts, we've got milestones, we've got resource planning, we've got timesheets. It's like, it's only the real heavy duty guys who are going to want more than that. And it's not that complicated, as you'll see. So once I've opened up the file, I'll already have a dashboard, this one here, and potentially others. I'll already have the API endpoints, but what I won't have is the connection to my data. And so what we need you to do is click this transform data button. And so this is the first sort of scary, little slightly complicated bit, especially as that used to be called literally only a couple of weeks ago, edit queries. And it was quite a thing to try and find out where edit queries had gone. 10 minutes of Google searching to find out what happened to edit queries had suddenly disappeared. And so once I've gone transform data, what that does is it brings up a different screen. It's called the Power Query Editor. And you don't need to be too scared by this at this point in time, because we're not going to do anything with these bits. We've already done them for you. It's just this last one down the bottom where it says endpoint URL. So if you click in that, you can see that this has a URL that basically is our dummy database. And so what typically our deployments are, the company or their deployment ID is sort of there, and then .unifi.com.au. That's not always the case. And if yours is different, it's basically whatever when you access UniPhi, it's whatever you're typing in to access UniPhi. So, we have another dummy database, practicemanagement.unifi.com.au. Whatever yours is, that's what needs to go in there. Just replacing that major projects. Once you've done that, and you then hit refresh preview, it'll basically pull in all of the data into these preview tables that is your data. Before it does that, it'll ask you to log in. So it can't do that unless you've got authentication. And so a little bit on authentication, if you just hit refresh, it'll prompt you to log in anyway. If you don't want to hit refresh, you want to actually change the sign in. And as I said, there's documentation around this as well as this recording. You can click data source settings and edit permissions and basically just change the authentication method. Now, again, we've got a mix of different authentication capability for our clients. If you access the system without logging in at all, and it's using your Windows login, that is where it uses the domain that you logged into the computer, the same account, then you're using a Windows authentication method. And you can click Windows and just use my current credentials, hit save, and that's it, job done. If you have to log into UniPhi using a form or Microsoft Outlook or Office 365, so if I just log out of this, if you have to log in using a form like that, then you're doing a basic form of authentication in Power BI. And this username and password is what you'll need to know to be able to get the authentication. So you go to basic and you type that username and password in and you click save and you're good to go again. And so once you've done that, the system now authenticates you and says, yes, okay, you're allowed to see this data and access it, and it'll pull that information into those tables. And once you're happy with all of that, you will click close and apply. And that will take a little bit of time, because in this screen, it's only going to do a preview. It does the first 1,000 records. When you click close and apply, it's going to create all the data into those tables. So I'm not going to do that for this demonstration, but when you click that to close and apply, this screen will close and you'll come back into the Power BI desktop screen and a box will pop up and it'll say refreshing, connecting to all of these endpoints that you can see over on the right-hand side, and it'll chug away. And that's when you go and become patriotic and get yourself a nice cup of tea, come back, and depending on the file size, it'll take anywhere between a minute and maybe even 10 minutes to refresh on its first load. It can be incremental after that, but the first one can be quite large. When one of our jobs has over 200,000 timesheet records in it, it takes a while for that to load. And if you've got a lot of cost plans that have a lot of 7 levels to them, it takes a little while for that to load as well. So those clients hopefully on the call know who you are. Just be patient, it'll get there. In this environment, even worse because it's over the VPN, but if you're on your network, it shouldn't be too bad. So what that means is that you have basically enabled yourself to start to build reports, which is exciting. If that all goes fine with no issues. However, you may get an error. So when that thing runs itself, it'll pop up with it either happened successfully or it had an error, and it'll tell you what the error was. And the way you'll access that, again, it will be back in that transform data. There'll be a link to it, or you can just click this button again, and there'll be a description of what didn't load. It'll be just above this table. It'll be errors there to say, and what it'll be 99 times out of 100 is that you don't have any risk data, for example. So if you've never logged a risk in UniPhi, and no one has, and you could go to the risk module in UniPhi and see of your deployment to see if there is any, then this will be an error. And so what you do is you just simplify everything to begin with. You think, oh, we may log risks later on, so I don't want to delete it, otherwise I have to re-enable it later. You can just right mouse button on that table and untick enable load. And so once you've set untick enable load, it's no longer going to bring that information in. Now there's two risk endpoints in the standard template. One is just the current risk profile, and the other is risk history, so that you can actually do a trend of how many very high, medium, low, very low risks you had over time, or any other type of trending, just to see whether mitigation strategies and contingencies are working, and whether you're actually lowering the risk profile on the portfolio, on a program, on a project, however you want to cut and dice that. So I've now disabled those endpoints, so that if you were then to close and apply again, it would chug along again to bring all the data in, and it should be successful on that particular occasion. And once it's all successful, bonds of beauty, you have everything there, you can start to build reports. So some of the things that you might need to consider before just building a report is, do I have all of the endpoints that I want? So go to the API documentation, have a look, have a think about the sorts of the reports that you're going to bring in, reconcile those to the tables on the right-hand side, and think, no, I need some project custom fields into my system. So you'll need to connect and create those additional endpoints. When you create an endpoint, you'll also need to tell Power BI how that endpoint relates to others. So for example, a project custom field table will have a project ID that you can link to the project table, so the two can talk. And the project table links to a whole bunch of tables, so that enables the custom field table to link to a whole bunch of others. And that's when you get into a little bit more business analysis kind of stuff that you may work with other people, including us, to get that set up. The other thing that's more business analysis and it needs to be considered, and it's kind of again, a bit of a consulting piece, or using business analysts that you may have in your business, is additional fields that you want to use to calculate that the power of Power BI gives you. So for example, you would have seen at the start, we had an S-curve for cash flow. That cumulative access doesn't come directly out of the Power BI. Power BI gives you the out of UniPhi. UniPhi will give you the month-by-month amounts of actual spend for a project, and by code and by contract potentially, and by contract deliverable. But if you wanted to build that up as a cumulative profile, you need to add in a measure within Power BI. And there's lots of online resources to help you do that. And out of the box, all of those measures are already there for cash flow anyway. So we've built some capability. So if I just flip back into the Power BI template, if I go to cash flow, for example, and I just expand that a bit so that you can see it. Actual running total in period end. We're going to rename these to make them a little bit more user-friendly. Budget running total in period end date, and net cash flow forecast in period end date. So these are the terminology that we've put in. Whenever you see a little calculator or a funny little square like that, then that's actually been added to the Power BI file rather than coming directly from UniPhi. Anything that's blank or has a sigma sign there is coming directly out of UniPhi. A sigma sign means it's a number that you can actually manipulate and do math on, sum, count, divide, what have you. And so, there's a fair few in there. And if you go down to timesheets, you can see, net present value calcs and things like that. If you come down to timesheets, there's a whole bunch more that's calculating billable percentages, billable hours, leave percentages, marketing percentages, non-billable percentages, and you can expand. And there's some Power BI files out there already that are pretty funky from some of our clients who got in early on this stuff, and do your own calculations around that. And that's really the big differentiator of having this, is that over the years we've had thousands of report requests that you have to then give to a developer. They have to build up into queries and build into reporting services, and you might get that back in a month or two, and then it's got one bit of data that it's missing, and you got to come back for a change. You should be able to turn these things around very quickly once the data structures and the measures are set up, or even adding these measures yourself. And so you need to think about those. What do you want to aggregate on, and how do you do it? Do some training in basic Power BI on how that happens, and basically build that up. And then once you think you've got all the data that you need, you can start to build reports. And you've seen some of the reports already. And then once you're happy with those, and we're going to do one in a moment, but building reports is basically building these things. Once you're happy with that and you want to share it with other people, you've got a few options. You can publish this to a Power BI workspace, and that's fairly simple. You can see publish there. You click that button, you will need a license with your company's Power BI workspace. It's a Power BI Pro license. It costs about $12.50 a month, and you might have enterprise deals that give you access to that. You'd need to apply again to Inhibitors of Technology to allow you to do that. And that will then publish to your workspace, and there'll be a URL given to you at the end of that process that you could click on, and then that can be shared to other people who have Power BI access to your workspace. And so that means it becomes a web-based application. You can actually share it around. People can click on it as long as they've got an account, a Power BI account, Office 365 integration. They'll access the reports you've built for them. You can also just save the Power BI desktop file and email it to someone, or upload it into UniPhi perhaps, or SharePoint, or some other collaborative tool that you can share files. They do tend to get reasonably large, although it's impressive how small they are considering some of the data sets that we've got. And so email can become problematic if it's large, but most of the time you can get away with emailing it around to people. There are some issues with that. If you ever connect to some other data and that data moves, or it's a file, you have to send the file to, that person has to download the file to a location, remap it. Gets a bit clunky. I mean, again, one of the benefits is you shouldn't have to do much of that. UniPhi is web-based. If you haven't got other data sources, it'll always connect back to that URL that you put in, and hence you can share these files a lot easier than other Power BI methodologies that are out there where they're using extractions into Excel or Access databases or something else like that. So that two other methods. And then the third one that we offer as a UniPhi service is to embed it into the application. And so that's the one where I went on my hamburger and went to reporting and Power BI dashboards. A lot of people who have got UniPhi on the call may not even have that option. And you can see on the apps, there's a Power BI embedded. That's there for our benefit. Basically what happens is you would ask us to enable Power BI embedded, and you will send us a desktop file that you're happy with, that you've created. So you will send us your version of this file, and we will publish it because it's actually our workspace, and we connect that to your deployment. And so it's something we manage in the background. You can't publish it yourself. And then we schedule a refresh, which is typically a nightly one. We're looking and working with clients on how quickly they need to refresh, but there is a significant cost impact on live. If you have a manual refresh button, or you're trying to refresh it hourly or half hourly, Microsoft bills by those refreshes. So there could be some cost impacts there. Out of the box, your subscription, you get a nightly refresh, which means you're looking at yesterday's data in a pretty sophisticated way, which would be unheard of in a modern external environment of collecting data and putting it into Excel and massaging it and putting it into Word and then maybe PowerPoint and then sending it off after collecting data that's probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks old already. So, we think overnight's not too bad. But we'll work through that and we'll see, and we'll take your user feedback on all of that, and we might change it over time. And so, if you get it into UniPhi, anyone who's got a program manager license subscription to UniPhi can then click on the hamburger, go to reporting, go to Power BI dashboards, and view what you've asked us to publish. And there's unlimited views for that. It doesn't cost you any more than what you're already paying. You can see that's the one embedded into the practice management presentation. So some timesheet performance and forward workload. And these are sort of interactive sort of things. You can see where Alex fits into the picture and interact with them and create whatever filters you think are relevant for the end user to use in this environment. So hopefully you can build something handy for your key stakeholders out of that. Again, I don't know to what level senior people would come in here and use that sort of stuff, but the capabilities there, and we think, we didn't want to build that capability and then not be able to share it. So we've absorbed the cost of sharing that into our relationship with Microsoft and enabled you to embed that into your Power BI for the same price that you've got your subscriptions for now. That's the current situation anyway. And so what we've done now is we've basically gone full circle from me showing you that Power BI embedded at the beginning and how the steps you need to go to get that set up and actually have a file that you can publish. And that's just what I went as about publishing. I forgot I'd written that one. So for embedding, you need to send us your completed desktop file. That's the key thing there. Yeah, if you're working with Power BI workspaces, you need to publish the file to that workspace, schedule a refresh within the Power BI interface. There's things to do that. There'll be people in your business who can do that. Create accounts that can access it, Power BI Pro accounts, and then communicate to people that they can access that and let them know the URL for doing so. All right, so with a little bit of time left, what I'm going to do now is just replicate this little file, this one report, the issues dashboard, just to give you a flavor of how you go about building these reports. So a little bit scary, but we'll see how we go. I've got that one there to remind me, but should be okay. Let's double check that I'm actually not talking to myself. That's good. Not everyone's left. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new tab and pretend the other one doesn't exist unless I forget what I did. And we'll probably need to do some reconciliation along the way. I'm going to create 4 charts within one report. They're all going to be sort of focused around the issue endpoint. So I'm just going to minimize the other ones. And what you have is, get rid of that, sort of 3 columns here that makes the sort of reporting view quite small. So I tend to minimize and maximize as I need to. And you'll use all 3 columns. And so as I scroll down, you'll see there's the issue endpoint. And the first thing we want to do is count how many issues we've got by category. And so the first thing to note is, what am I going to count on? And it's best to count on something that's unique and also a number, because it does the math faster. It could count descriptions, but it will take longer. And if you've got a large data set, we want to try and optimize that. So in the issues table, there's a field called ID. And you can see it's got the sigma thing there. And so I can just basically drag that across, or even just tick it into the values. And it'll pick a default visualization to begin with. I'll just maximize that for the moment. And it picked the table. So this is the table visualization, and it's actually counted them, which is what I want. It's automatically decided that. If you wanted to list all the IDs, you could just change that to don't summarize, and it'll list all the IDs. But we want to actually count them. And we want to count them broken up into the category descriptions that we use. And so again, if I just tick that, it'll come in and it'll say we've got 12 as bugs, we've got 196, which is my bugbear of, pardon the pun, sound like my son, not categorizing issues. It's like, please categorize issues, otherwise we can't do anything with them. So there's 196 uncategorized issues in this dummy database, heaven forbid. I'm just going to make that around the other way. So I just dragged it up to be the top. And then you can just start clicking different visualizations and see what happens. That's pretty much what Power BI is all about. So there's a pie chart one. We were talking about pies and donuts and hamburgers. We may as well keep the food flavor going. And that has replicated the first graph that you saw on the other dashboard. 2 seconds of work. Now, it may be that you only want open projects. That's when you'd need to bring in a different table. We go to the project one, and in there, there'll be a field that says current phase is complete. You drag that over to the filter column, and you can do it just on the visual, or you can do it for all the visuals on a page. That's up to you. I select that, and I can say false, and that just means this is now showing the account of all the issues that are in live projects. Now, someone I'm hearing in the background saying, well, what if we only want open ones? Well, you go back up to your issue endpoint, and there will be a status description, and you can drag that into the filter and say, give me there's 3 statuses to an issue in UniPhi: open, awaiting review, and closed. And we can tick open, and now we've got just open issues. And so that's our first one. We go back to the report, we can make it a bit bigger and center it to a similar location that we had before. Some of the things you have to do then is sort of fiddle with names so that just call it category. You can get rid of that, and that'll doesn't change the underlying file field name. It just changes the label that will come into this report. The next one was a count of issues by sector. So again, we can tick ID because we want a count of ID. We want project sector, so we're going to go to our project endpoint, go sector description. You can see this time, instead of giving me a table, it decided randomly to give me a graph. If you don't like that and you like to see the numbers first, you just tick the table so that you can have a look at the data before you graph it. This time we're going to go donut, and we've now created the same graph as we had in our other report, but again, without those filters. If I wanted them on everyone, I could have just go back to that visualization I did before and just move them all from filters on this visual to filters on this page, which I'm not going to do. Bring that over here. And then we start to make them a bit bigger, fiddling around with that like you would in other systems that get fiddly. It says ID by category. That's not very user-friendly. So again, you can click on the visual, go to the ID, and say issue count by category. And now that label will be a little bit issue count by category, a little bit more explicit. Do the same on that one, and you're off and running. Next one's a little bit more complicated. What we're going to do is track how many have been raised over time. And so within the issue table, again, there'll be a field called created date. And there's one that's an aggregate of that into months. And so if we were to do that, it basically creates a list of all of the months where issues have been created. So again, if I just blow this up, since this database has been set up. And I can then go to my ID again and click on that. And it's saying, you know, how many were created in that period. So 2 issues in April 2013, 12 in July. Now you could do a cumulative measure on that, but for now we're just going to do this as a column graph month by month. Here's our column graphs. We want that one. And that looks a little bit blue. So then we're going to think about how can we make it a bit more colorful, and we can just think of something. So some sort of aggregate. So maybe this time we can aggregate it by project type description. So if we tick that, or we drag it down into the legend, it's now got a bit of color to it, but it's made it a little bit too many within the screen. So that didn't quite work to plan. But what I could do is change the timeline of that, which is what I'm going to do because it was in the other report. And so I'll drag this down the bottom. Believe me, there is a report there, you just can't see it. And we're going to basically create a timeline for these counts. And that's called a slicer. And so this little slicer here, we click on it. That's the visual that we're doing at the moment. We go to the created date in the issues table. Chuck that in there, and it automatically creates a timeline field that if I blow up again, we can say just do it from the last couple of years. I mean, you could type it in there, but it's so much more fun to drag a little dot, isn't it? And now it's a little bit bigger, but it's still not as good as the other one. So I've done something wrong there, but we can work that out later. Let's try and make it a bit prettier. But we now have our slicer, and that would have updated all the graphs. So they've all got that pie chart is now, and donut is now reflecting on what's in that date range. Equally, all the graphs interrelate. So if I just minimize these for a bit so you can actually see it, if I tick residential, it'll update and highlight how much was residential in the other graphs, which is pretty funky. And now I've got to go back to my thing because I can't remember what the fourth one was. There, and this is a count of issues assigned by person, which is interesting. Who's got the most issues assigned to them? And so to do that, we've got within the issue table itself, you can go off to people endpoints and do this, but we've also included this information in the tables that we think people will use them in, just so that we don't have to do that necessarily, and makes it a bit simpler for end users, hopefully. And so it's a new visualization. Let's click in the white space so that it knows I want to create a new one. Expand the visualization section, and we want assigned to, and we want count of ID. And that's pretty much done it again for us. You can see that some issues don't have anyone assigned to it, so they're unlikely to get resolved. And it's done in alphabetical order. You can actually change that in this visual by going sort by ID. And so we now got that list there. We can then filter that if that's going to be too long. And the way you do that, I think it's this one. Yes. On the name, what you can do is there's a top N type filter, which is really cool. And if you just say top 10, and then again, drag the ID into there, it'll do a top 10 of the count of IDs and apply that filter, and then you'll only get 10 names there. And so if we go back, we now just need to change that visual to this little funnel one, and we've got the same, kind of the same graph. There must be a filter difference between the two there. And again, if I minimize all of these screens, which won't be there when you publish it, obviously, so that makes it a little bit bigger, you can see that Cindy Lauper's our top assigned 9 issues for girls who just want to have fun. We also have the project name slicer and a text box and an image. So to quickly finish off this particular graph, I can bring back visualizations, pull in the slicer again, expand my fields, go to the project, select name. And then there's a little trick here. There's a little option there that enables you to change it from a list to a drop down. Make it a bit smaller, get it in a location that you want over here. You can see the reds help you line up the text. We're going to put an image and a text box over on the left, so give it a bit of space. Come back here, go image, go to desktop. There's a wonderful logo, isn't that pretty? Make it a bit smaller. Set text box, issue, dashboard. It's a bit small, highlight it, make it 20, shrink this, drag it to the bottom. That apply changes is giving me a bit of grief. Just using arrow key to line it up. Now I can get it up the top here and do it a bit quicker. I want to get it sort of lined to the bottom of the eye. And then these are out of whack now too, but I won't worry and bore you with that too much. And we're done. Round of applause. Thank you very much. And that's it. That's basics. Gone from no data to having a dashboard to publishing it and enabling other people to view it and see it and analyze it. Is this one particularly interesting? Perhaps not. You'll have to come up with the ones that are going to solve your problems. But the fact that you've got access to that raw data, this is an aggregate across the entire portfolio. I'm not looking at a specific project or a specific type of project, which I can do, but that type of aggregation is very quick, very simple, and hopefully will benefit you in analyzing performance and determining where projects are underperforming and who's not closing out their issues. I will stop the recording now.